Hi everyone, Christina here. Welcome to another card video at my YouTube channel and blog. Today I'm creating a card or a couple cards using two different types of watercolor paper. I thought I would try out the same technique on both types of watercolor paper and see how they compare, just to see how the different watercolor papers behave, if one looks better than the other, or if one is a little bit easier to achieve the look I want compared to the other. The first type of watercolor paper I'm using today is hot pressed paper from Arches. In the past, I've only used this particular paper when I'm stamping an image and then I'm going to be watercoloring the image. I find that it's a little bit easier to stamp and get a nice crisp line on hot pressed paper because it is a very smooth watercolor paper in comparison to the more rough texture on a cold pressed paper. So I've really only ever had experience with painting in images on hot press paper. But for the cards today, I'm actually doing a watercolor background. So I really wanted to see how much water the paper could hold, see if I would get some pretty bloomed areas, and also just to add more and more water on top and see how the watercolor behaves. Speaking of the watercolor paint, today I'm using some Winsor & Newton Professional Artist watercolors, and the brush I'm using is actually a brush that's nearly 12 years old. I recently found my stash of watercolor supplies from college, and this is a Princeton round size 6 brush. If I can find these online, I'll be sure to link them down below in the video description or over at my blog. I had 2 or 3 different Princeton brushes in my stash, so I'll kind of add those into my brush rotation with my watercolor supplies. So you'll notice that I did quite a bit of painting. I let that dry, came in with some more color, and then I added just some water droplets on top. And then some of the places I wasn't able to get the water droplets in the place where I wanted, so I grabbed my brush and actually dropped in little pools of water with the tip of my brush. I also brought in a little bit more of that red coral color just to add more interest into that center area. I realized that as it dried that it really bloomed out and pushed all the color to the outer edges of that watered down area, and so it really left that center area blank, and I wanted to add more detail. So I'm going to set that aside to dry, and I'm letting these air dry. In the past, you guys know I'm super impatient and I can't bring myself to wait long enough to let it dry, but I really forced myself to let it air dry because I realized that this blooming effect with the wet paint on the over the dry, I was really only going to achieve that if I let it air dry. And that's because as it dries, all of that color pushes, or the water pushes all the color to the sides, and that's when you get those really pretty harsh edges on your blooms. And so I wanted to give it as much time as possible to achieve that look. In comparison to the cold press paper, which you just saw, where I used yellows and greens, I found that the blooming didn't happen quite as quickly, and the paper took a little bit longer to dry. It did handle just as much water. I think both of the papers could handle a lot of water, but I also didn't overwork the areas too much. I really kind of kept it quick and loose and then just let them air dry. So now I'm using that stamp set that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. This is the Blog Buddies stamp set from Mama Elephant. I've stamped the images in VersaFine Smoky Gray ink, which is a permanent ink. And I heat set that ink just to make sure it was completely dry before I came in with some water on a clean brush. I'm hoping to lift out some of that color from those areas inside the stamped images. And on the hot pressed paper, not a lot of color was lifted. You'll notice on that computer mouse, it looks very, very pale. That was the best area that I was able to get that color to lift out. And I wanted to mention that I got this lifting idea, or I was inspired to do this lifting from the Watercolor for Card Makers Intermediate Techniques class that's happening at online card classes right now. It's still open for registration if you want to go take that class. In fact, it's open for registration from here on out because this class is a lifetime access class. So even if you're watching this video 2 years from now, you can still go sign up for that class and benefit from the lessons. That class is taught by Dawn Woolslegel, and she is fantastic. I'm learning so much in that class. So I'm adding a lot of water and then trying to pick it up with my paper towel, and not a lot of water was picking up. So I decided to use kind of a scrubbing technique that Dawn talks about in class. I'm basically just trying to scrub away some of that color. I'm trying to lift that color off of the surface of the paper. Now this is the cold pressed paper, and I noticed that the lifting was a little bit easier on the cold pressed paper. I wasn't as nervous about scratching the surface because this is a little bit more of a hardy surface. It's got a rough texture, so that worked out really well on the cold press versus the hot pressed paper. So I've let those dry completely. Now I'm adding some sequins. These are 8mm and 5mm crystal sequins from Darice. And the way I like to adhere these down onto my cards is I use a bottle of Ranger Multimedia Matte that I've put a quilled precision tip on. And I like that tip because it makes it so I can have a little tiny itty bitty drop of adhesive from each sequin. So I'm using that, and I'll make sure I link that down in the video description and in the supplies at my blog in case you want to get one of these tips for your small bottles. I have the tip on my this bottle, which is the Ranger Multimedia Matte, and I also have it on a Ranger Glossy Accents bottle. I'm using some tweezers to pick up those sequins and then adhere them down onto the cards. Now I realized that my paper was on both of them was really, really warped. And I'm not sure why they're particularly more warped than I've had experience with in the past. I sort of suspect that it's because I let them air dry, so the water really moved around quite a bit, whereas if I had heat set it, it would have stopped that water from moving, and so maybe it wouldn't have warped as much. I think I need a little bit more experimenting to know for sure if that's the case, but I suspect that that's the reason why. So because the papers were so warped, I ended up cutting them down and then putting them on top of some Nina Desert Storm card bases. This is the 100-pound version of that cardstock, and I really like how it offset the soft colors on both watercolor pieces. So those are the cards for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will be back with another card video very, very soon. Until then, happy card making, and I'll see you later.